I'd like us to get underway today. It's a distinct honor for me as the Dean of the Faculty of Education to welcome so many of you here as our guests on this second annual event of the faculty. This is an occasion where we want to show our eagerness to share in activities with our colleagues in the field and throughout the university. Some of you will know that last year we were privileged to have Dr. John Goodlad here to visit with us. And this year, as we invited Dr. Eisner, and he graciously accepted our invitation, we found soon thereafter that the interest in him and his ideas was of such a proportion that we were eager to open the event to as many as wanted to participate with us. It's a real tribute to Dr. Eisner that he is regarded this way throughout the profession. We have in our midst today superintendents of schools, principals, teachers, government officials, faculty members, students, friends of the faculty, and all are welcome. We hope that you enjoy the experience of these two sessions today. You'll note in front a bit of advertising. And please excuse me if I take advantage of this command audience to provide a bit of publicity with respect to this event. The faculty is undertaking an extended celebration throughout 1991 and 92 of its 50-year history as a faculty within the University of Alberta. Some of you may think that that isn't a particularly long period of time, but we would want you to know that this is just one of many of our birthdays that we might have chosen to celebrate. We were actually first identified as a distinctive part of the university community in 1929, when we were identified as a school of education. Later in the early 40s, we became a college of education, and then 50 years ago in April of 92, we became the Faculty of Education. Over that period of time, we believe that there have been many important accomplishments and achievements of this faculty. It really is quite a unique one in Canadian educational history, and especially in Alberta educational history. And for that reason, we believe that there is much to celebrate. But we want the celebration to be something that not only looks to the past, but even more importantly, anticipates and celebrates the future. We will, during this year, host a number of events, sponsor a number of activities that we believe will be a way of sending an important signal to our colleagues around the world. There will be a number of conferences that will be sponsored, beginning almost immediately with the Tri-University Conference in Educational Foundations, sponsored and led by our Department of Educational Foundations and the faculty. In the fall, our Department of Educational Administration will celebrate a birthday of its own, 35 years as a Department of Educational Administration. That will be a joint activity as a part of the faculty anniversary as well. There will also be a number of lecture series that will be sponsored during the year. A special conference in the spring of 92 in the area of teacher preparation with the practicum as a central focus for that. 3 or 4 of the journals that are edited within the faculty will have special issues. Our Alberta Journal of Educational Research will be one. The Journal on Pedagogy and Phenomenology will be another. the Special Education Journal yet a third. There will also be in the fall a homecoming event that will be held in conjunction with the university homecoming celebration. And there promised to be a number of activities on that weekend, the last weekend in September, where there will be things going on within the faculty, where all of our former students, faculty, those who have been associated with the faculty will be warmly welcomed. There will be a major banquet and dance on that weekend as well. And then in June of 1992, the university has approved a special convocation to be held in recognition of the Faculty of Education. And at that time, the university will recognize with honorary doctorates two who have been nominated for this award within the faculty. Just as a sidelight, I'm pleased to announce that this spring's convocation will have a similar flavor to it, in that our former dean, Dr. Walter Worth, has been designated as one of the recipients of an honorary doctorate in this spring's convocation. So we're delighted with that, and that in many ways will serve as a warm-up to the event a year from now. My reason for bringing this to your attention is that we know that many of you have been former students or have been associated with the faculty in important ways, and we hope that you would make sure that these activities and events are on your calendars, and that you in turn spread the word and welcome others to be with us. Today it's a distinct honor for me to welcome and introduce Dr. Elliot Eisner. He's not a stranger to Edmonton or to the faculty or to members of the profession. We're delighted that he has agreed to return to us to share his thoughts with us. We regard it as a distinct honor, Dr. Eisner, to have such a special individual in our midst, a well-regarded and respected educator throughout the world. There are many friends of Dr. Eisner in the Edmonton area to whom we owe thanks, for I'm sure that their influence has been important in helping us to attract Dr. Eisner to be with us on this occasion. And judging by the response to our invitations, I really have no need to introduce Dr. Eisner to a group such as this. You've shown by your response and your enthusiasm for his visit, your familiarity with him and with his work. Just for those that may not recognize his accomplishments and numerous contributions in the field of education, and point out to you that he is a professor of education and art at Stanford University. He has been acknowledged for his leadership in these fields for many years. He received numerous awards for his work, including Fulbright and Guggenheim Fellowships, the Palmer Johnson Memorial Award of the AERA, and recognitions for distinguished contributions in curriculum fields. Some may be aware that just this past week he has been designated as the President-elect of the American Educational Research Association, which is a very distinct recognition to one who hasn't necessarily been in the mainstream of the tradition of that organization, and I'm sure it's a way of saying that there is respect and appreciation for the singular contribution that he has made. He has been a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science. He holds 3 honorary doctorates, has authored or edited at least 11 books in the field of education. Among these, the educational imagination, the art of educational evaluation, and more recently, the enlightened eye, qualitative inquiry, and the enhancement of educational practices. As I thought of the things that we could look forward to and anticipate, I found a statement in one of his works that I think captures some of the concerns and the interests that characterize Dr. Eisner. Quoting from one of his sources, "The arts are areas of human performance and experience that require a willingness to suspend the practical, to venture into the world of imagination, to play with images, ideas, and feelings, to be able to recognize and construct the multiple meanings of events, to perceive and conceive of things from various perspectives, to be able to be a clown, a dreamer, a taker of risks. These are some of the personal inclinations that arts require, both for their appreciation and creation. To what extent do our schools nurture such dispositions? To what extent do they stimulate them? To what extent do they instead encourage routine, convergent modes of thinking, beliefs in right answers, cognitive rigidity, tolerance for boredom, literalness in perception, and specificity in meaning?" I think as you have occasion to listen to Dr. Eisner, you will see some of those same thoughts and ideas permeating his work. We're grateful that we have one to challenge us in this respect. We welcome you, look forward to hearing from you. Dr. Eisner, please.
Well, first of all, it's a privilege for me, as well as a pleasure, to come back to Edmonton. I come to Canada often. I always like to come to Canada. I enjoy the people and the general disposition of Canadians and the kind of sense that they make out of educational matters. I want to thank Dean Patterson for the introduction. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to tell the young man on the video camera that you're going to have to keep alert because I'm going to move around. So you just can't have it fixed. The other thing that I want to say is that I am not going to read a lecture at you, and this is no canned presentation. I'm going to be working with some ideas that are in process and sort of reflect where I am and where my head is. And you don't have to believe anything that you hear this afternoon. These are ideas to chew on, and I intend to share them with you this afternoon and this evening. This evening I'm going to be talking about educational evaluation, assessment, a word that is very salient in discussions about what we used to call evaluation. And as a matter of fact, it was one of the largest categories of sessions. I think there were about 32 sessions devoted to assessment at the recent American Educational Research Association convention, from which I have just come. It was, I think, the fourth or fifth largest category among the categories that had sessions. But this afternoon, what I'd like to do is to focus on what makes schools tick, structural analysis. I think all of us, almost all of us here who've been around in education for a number of years, recognize that not all of the efforts that we have made to try to improve the quality of education have succeeded. And I think very few of us are interested in moving through life engaged in efforts that don't have the kind of consequences, at least the level of consequence that we would like our efforts to have. And so I am led to try to think about what it is that makes schools robust institutions, difficult to alter in significant ways, and how it might be that we can think about schools in ways that might lead to an institution and a form of shared life that provides both students and teachers and school administrators with the kind of environment and opportunity that I guess all of us would like them to have to grow and to create the kind of civilization in the long haul that we envision. Efforts to improve schools, as I read the literature, have been rooted in conceptions that do not adequately reflect their fundamental features, and also are rooted in metaphors that leads one to believe that fixing schools is like fixing refrigerators. Some apparently believe that when schools fail, the problem is located in a failure of a part. And if the part can't be fixed, it needs to be replaced. And if it can't be replaced, a new refrigerator needs to be installed. Indeed, we do talk about installing curriculas like we talk about installing refrigerators. And we try to align our installations so that there's some kind of continuity. Occasionally, we invent new accoutrements to make minor improvements or to confer a new look on an old box. Ice makers, side-by-sides, decor panels. But despite these superficial modifications, it is, after all, pretty much the same old box. I want to argue that our conception of school improvement needs to be radically altered, and our metaphors need to be closer to the heart of schooling. We need to shift, I think, from a mechanical model of school improvement to a biological one. We need to shift from thinking about refrigerators to thinking about school improvement as more like maintaining a friendship or cultivating a plant. In Canada and in the United States, we've gone through a number of innovative practices. There was team teaching, you remember that. Cooperative learning, which is now salient. Mastery learning. Mentoring. Flexible scheduling, for those of you who were around in the 60s. Computer-assisted instruction. Outcome-based education. Precision teaching. Discovery learning. The structure of the disciplines. Behavioral objectives. Individually prescribed instruction. Open education. Ungraded schools. Site-based management. Restructuring. Accountability. One could go on. At present in the United States, there is a growing interest in the design of a national examination, which in turn, some hope, will lead to a national curriculum. And I was on a panel at AERA in which one of the justifications for having a national examination, which would need, in order to be meaningful, to be related to a national curriculum, is that we could then have international comparisons, assuming we had an international curriculum. So you get the idea from a local issue to something which would make it possible to know exactly where every school was in relation to France, Taiwan, Japan, the Sudan, I suppose, wherever. Those who advocate such approaches reason that if the foregoing innovations that I listed did not work the way we would like, perhaps mandating and monitoring will, and by mandating a national curriculum, there will be a common set of standards for all. By monitoring through a national examination, there will be no ambiguity about the extent to which standards have been achieved. All of this emerges, ironically, at the same time that there is an increased appetite for something called the professionalization of teaching, teacher empowerment, and other conceptions that place a heavy emphasis on the autonomy of decision-making and the exercise of professional judgment. Now, I have tried to think about why these efforts that we make appear, at least they appear to me, like coming up against a large gyroscope that we push, which tilts to a side for a while and then rights itself after a while. And I really feel a little dismayed thinking about going through a professional lifetime pushing gyroscopes that right themselves. I would like to think about my work, and I suspect you'd like to think about your work as being a participant in an effort that doesn't return to its old state when efforts are made, but really changes things for the better, makes an improvement in states of affairs. I don't want to suggest in this discourse that there haven't been some improvements, but I don't want to be Pollyannish about where we are. And if you were to look at the major statements that have been made about American schools, at least, people who have studied schools like John Goodlad or like Ted Sizer, like Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, like Bob Dreeben, some of the work that I have done, there are some commonalities that we need to be concerned about. Didacticism in teaching very often prevails. Boredom for many children is a common characteristic of their experience in school. Curricular fragmentation, a lack of discretionary time for teachers, and so forth. There are some common elements. The need to establish treaties between students and teachers so that one can get on with it. And I try to think about what it is that contributes to the robust, sometimes almost intractable quality of school and the difficulty in improvement. And I'd like to share with you some of the dimensions, some of the features that appear to me to be important in creating resistance to change. And I would like then to talk about some dimensions that can be taken into account, and which I believe ought to be taken into account in order to deal with schools in ways that are more biological than mechanical, more ecological, more comprehensive, more organic than the installation of a new, fancier refrigerator. First, I think that schools, as robust systems, are typically, the efforts that we make are typically too weak to alter the other factors in the school that confer stability on it. And I think that what happens when we bring an innovation in is that the innovation is changed by the factors in the institution that are not altered. So that we may, for example, advocate that teachers employ a particular pedagogical method, discovery teaching and learning, for example. But we do not restructure the school in ways that make it possible for teachers to acquire the kind of techniques, the kind of understanding, the kind of opportunities that they need to be able to teach in forms that are different from the ways in which they have been teaching. And we do not employ modes of assessment that are congruent with the kinds of outcomes that would emanate from such an approach to pedagogy. So the new innovation runs up against factors that are inhospitable to it, and after a while, the innovation wears out. What it tends to generate among teachers often is a kind of cynicism, that this too will pass, that I've been here before, it has come and it has gone, and in about 3 years it will be over, and everything will be the same as it was. It's a kind of passive resistance because there has been no buy-in, and there has been no buy-in because nothing else has changed to make that buy-in important in the teacher's life. Second, the behavior of teachers and administrators is, I think, both intelligent and adaptive. Teachers and administrators do what they know how to do. They can do little else, and that given the constraints within which they work, they tend to seek, as all of us, the most efficient and effective form of adaptation. Teaching and administering in the context of a school draws upon what teachers and administrators know how to do. It draws upon their conceptions of what the act of teaching is about and what being administrator entails. And it is difficult, I think, to fault someone for not implementing a program or a practice that goes beyond their own competencies. And related to what I was saying before, the need to create the kind of space and opportunities that make it possible for those new innovations to take hold is something that we tend to neglect about. We underestimate the changes that have to be made in conception, in skill, in the practice of education, in trying to bring about these new possibilities in schools and classrooms. It's a fact, I think, that is almost unique to schooling and to the practice of education in the context of schools. That teaching, for example, is one of the only professions that I know of in which professional socialization to the profession begins at age 5. Teachers have learned what the role consists of by having many, many, many opportunities to observe that role directly in classrooms, observing teachers' work. That begins with kindergarten and it goes through the 5th grade, through the 12th grade. As a matter of fact, children probably spend more time observing teachers directly than they spend time observing their parents. And so the kinds of models that are generated early on in terms of what teaching consists of and what teachers ought to do and what a school principal ought to do is, I think, something that youngsters appropriate as a result of being a student in a school. If a child wishes to be a chemist or even an airline pilot, in a way they don't have to unlearn certain kinds of practices in order to acquire the forms of action, the forms of thinking that a program preparing a chemist or an airline pilot would make possible. But youngsters who come into teacher education programs bring with them a whole repertoire of expectations. They can not only play house, they can play school. And they can play school very well, and they can play school very well because they've been exposed. They've spent an enormous amount of their time in the context of schools. And so one of the things, I think, that creates the kind of traditional stability that schools display is related to the ways in which teachers are socialized. And I am saying that teachers are socialized well before they become a part of the profession, well before they come become a member of an education program in a university. Another factor that creates stability in schools is related to the one I've just indicated, and that is that the expectations of students and parents, their expectations for schools, are very often congruent with the conceptions that their teachers hold. And if their teachers' conceptions are congruent with their own past experience, you have a reinforcement coming from the community for expectations that may not be as hospitable as we would like to other forms of learning and other modes of teaching. So that when parents express concerns about what their child is able to do, or whether their child is not having enough homework, or whether there is sufficient emphasis on certain forms of instruction, those expectations also tend to create a set of limits, or in a way impediments to substantial change. Flexible scheduling, for example, in the 1960s ran into a great deal of difficulty at the high school level because many parents were very concerned that in developing a program in which students had a hand in shaping the allocation of their own time and location of study, that there wasn't sufficient monitoring on the school's part of where students were. And so the expectation for the school to provide a kind of custodial care created a difficulty for that orientation to the management of time to take root. The expectation that there be correct answers, always single ones, for problems engaged in or questions raised, an expectation that can grow from prior experience, also can create difficulties for youngsters who are engaged in a program in which the teacher may have a disposition to help youngsters understand that not every question has a single answer and not every problem has a single correct solution, and in fact that there are multiple perspectives, and that for many questions and problems there are not adequate answers, and there may not be answers at all to some of them. Another area that I think creates resistances to change in the area of pedagogy in particular has to do with the fact that we have designed schools typically in ways that make it very difficult for those who teach to get a good fix on what it is that they're up to in the course of teaching. One of the salient features of being a teacher is the feature of being alone. Teachers are with children all day, to be sure, but they are not with other adults in the course of their work. It is rare for that to happen. It happens at times, but it is not a common feature. When you think of a teacher and a class, you think of a teacher who works in a school in which there are classrooms, in which there are 28 to 35 youngsters, and the teacher spends his or her time in that setting, by and large, working with those youngsters. The opportunity to learn about one's own teaching and to change one's own teaching as a result of getting good critical feedback on performance is very limited, very limited. In fact, I would argue that one of the few places in which the observation and critical analysis of performance is taken seriously in schools, particularly in high schools, is on the athletic field. That is where it really counts for some schools and communities, where winning matters and where the coach whose team does not remain. But by and large, teachers spend their days, as I spend mine when I teach, working alone, trying to read in the eyes of my students how it is that I'm doing, and the problem, of course, is that those eyes are too small. They don't reflect enough. And most of us, when it comes to performance in such arenas, suffer from a kind of secondary ignorance, which is a serious impediment to professional development in the art and craft of teaching. By secondary ignorance, what I mean is that form of ignorance which is, I guess, fundamentally different from primary ignorance. If you have primary ignorance, you know that you don't know something. If you have secondary ignorance, you don't know something, but you don't know that you don't know it. And when you don't know that you don't know something, you're not in a good position to do anything about it. That is as true in the context of a friendship as it is in the context of being a parent, as it is in being a teacher. So for whatever reason, we have designed schools that make it difficult for people, and I include myself as a college professor, to really understand how I can change what it is that I'm up to. We've created these nests. I want to tell you that you will have teachers working in schools for 20 years, who have never seen their colleagues teach. They will have lunch with them. They will attend a faculty meeting with them, but they have never seen them in action. Incidentally, that's not necessary. I won't get into what can be done about that maybe this evening, but that's not a necessary condition. And how do we cope with that sense of insulation and isolation? How do we enhance teaching? Well, we do it through a process called in-service education, which usually means leaving the workplace in order to get advice from a professor or somebody else selling something on how to do something better. Problem is, of course, that the person giving the advice has never seen the people receiving it do the job in the first place. It's like going to a voice coach to give you advice about how to sing who's never heard you do so. And for complex forms of activity like teaching, generalizations do not go very far. So what I am saying is that if you want to get better at teaching, and this is a resistance to change because of the way in which we have structured schools, we need to create conditions that provide the kinds of mirrors, if you will, metaphorically speaking, so that those of us who spend a substantial amount of our time as pedagogues, as teachers, can get some understanding of how we function. In that sense, it is my view that the major location for teacher education, is not in the university. It is in the workplace. It is in that institution in which people spend 20 years or more of their lives. Don't take that to mean that there is no room or place in the university for teacher preparation. It is propedeutic. It is preparatory. But no 21-year-old or 22-year-old coming out of the University of Alberta or Stanford University has finished their professional education. It's a lifelong activity. Another impediment, I'm going through the impediments. I'm not here to depress you about these impediments. but I do so because I am trying to understand the conditions that we're dealing with in making schools better places for youngsters and for kids. And I don't want to come off as saying they're dysfunctional. That's not the message. I'm trying to get across the notion that there's more to do, and a lot of the things that we try to do don't take, and I'm trying to understand why they don't take. And I'm trying to do that analytically by understanding some of the dimensions or identifying some of the dimensions that I think get in the way. I think very often our high-stakes examination systems get in the way. There are a lot of different functions that evaluation and testing in particular perform. One of them is gatekeeping, providing access, opening or closing access to opportunities for youngsters, for their social, economic, indeed their educational mobility. And very often the conventional categories of performance that are assessed engender a reluctance to take the kinds of pedagogical risks that might jeopardize the student's ability to do well on those examinations. So that parents and others who keep their eye on those gates do so for very reasonable reasons. It is important for many people to have access to the University of Alberta, to have access to Stanford University, to have access to the University of Illinois, and that means doing well on examinations that are defined by the best lights that we have available, but which aren't as good as we would like them to be, and which often do not reflect the things that we care about the most. But nevertheless, in a practical world, we have to deal with these things, and indeed we do. And I must tell you that I am having and have had something of a long-term battle with my own institution with respect to the kinds of criteria that our admissions committee employs when it considers students for admission to Stanford. It is a conservative admissions committee, and it's reflected in practices that they employ with respect to what they include when they calculate the student's performance, the grades that they've received, what they include and what they exclude, and why they do it. And their views, and I'm sharing this with you, their views are rooted in a certain conception of what it means to be intelligent, what it means to be bright. And in many ways, it limits many youngsters who have very high-level abilities and special forms of intelligence that are socially very important, but which are not reflected on the criteria that are employed. My point here is that the gatekeeping functions of institutions of higher education and the examination systems that we employ often constrain innovation. They constrain innovation because we often want to assess in ways that make it possible to be able to locate a youngster in a distribution on a variable. That is to say, we have given a very sacred place to the normal distribution historically, even though we have criterion reference tests. And it's important to know where you stand. To know where you stand, you have to run on the same track towards the same destination. Trouble is, youngsters don't start at the same starting place. But we do that, and then we pick the winners. While we do that, we also talk about the importance of individuality and unique talents and personal vision and your own signature. And I think as we increasingly develop, and I think we will develop, forms of assessment which, though they may give youngsters common tasks, they will not give them common response opportunities, so that we will have not just a matter of a selection of an answer, but the construction of a response. And that is going to have some consequences, because that is going to make it difficult to make the kinds of comparisons that we're accustomed to making. And it will be labor intensive, and it will be complicated, and it will create ambiguities, and it will make difficult the task of knowing exactly where one student stands in relation to another. And for my own educational values, I think that's healthy, even though it's going to be more time-consuming than using an optical scanner to know whether the correct bubble has been filled in correctly. But when we use the bubble and when we use standardized expectations, we tend to try to, in a way, train up youngsters to perform at a level that is congruent with what we believe to provide the kinds of access that they want, that their parents want, and that very often we think they should have access to in the first place. These are some of the factors that I think get in the way. And as a result of the foregoing, what we have, I think, in lieu of genuine educational improvement are periodic bursts of enthusiasm over new educational slogans. Restructuring, for example, has just about faded as a notion in California with the pressure from a serious shortfall in funding and a growing interest in what is called performance assessment. So I start with a major premise, namely that human behavior is adaptive and intelligent, that teachers, students, and administrators do what they know how to do in light of the circumstances with which they must cope. There is also ample evidence that fragmented, piecemeal alterations of specific parts do not stick. They are transitory and ephemeral, like the huge gyroscope I described earlier. A school pushed by a temporary nudge returns to its upright position. To make significant improvements in the quality of education, we need, I think, to think about education as a whole. Yet how can we change the whole, and what should it be changed to? What is it that we really want in any case? I'd like to identify, before I go into some of the dimensions that I think need attention, I'd like to identify what I think constitutes an important array of outcomes for educationally effective schools. I think these are important. I think they are not outcomes that are generally talked about in education, but I think they are critical in a deep sense. I think they're critical in the sense that we need to project beyond the immediate into a conception that has to do with the ways in which life is led. And the first one I want to identify is in the formulation of intentions, our intention as people concerned with education to try to create a relationship between the student and the subject matter so that there is a deep affection between the two. A deep affection. A kind of, if you will, love affair between what the student studies and the student doing the studying. The connection between the student and the work undertaken. And I know that when I say this to this audience, that it may even sound maudlin. It is very simple, but it is not simple to achieve. The reason I think this is such an important aim, such an important concern in education, is because the important outcomes of schooling are not primarily located, I would argue, in the context of schools. The important consequences of schooling are not primarily to help youngsters do well in school. The important aims of schooling is to develop a kind of disposition, an array of skills that will manifest themselves in life outside of school. To teach people how to read who can read but never do is no victory. It is a Pyrrhic victory at best. To develop critical forms of thinking which can be applied with skill in the context of a social studies class, but which is forgotten outside of a social studies class or unemployed, is no victory. And so the ramifications, the significant educational ramifications of schooling, if we were really serious about it, we haven't gotten there yet, we haven't even talked about it, nobody is talking about it. If you really want to know where assessment should take place, I don't know how to do this. There are a lot of things I'm talking about that I don't know how to do. The real location is in what people do when you're not looking at them, if I can speak metaphorically. There's a difference between what somebody can do and what somebody will do. And what people will do is clearly as important as what they can do. So the development of a program in school that in some way, gets youngsters to understand that the journey is the reward, that the attainment of the objective may not be the most important thing. And again, I don't want to demean accomplishment, but I want to emphasize the consummatory, aesthetic, experiential rewards of intellectual and artistic engagement. That's not on President Bush's list. And I don't know if it's on the list of this province's lists of goals either. But if it is, fine. If it isn't, it should be. I think it's important in terms of our intentions to broaden our conception of literacy. We tend to think about literacy as the ability to read and write, but I would like to deal with literacy basically as the process of constructing meaning, constructing and recovering meaning. And meaning is constructed and recovered not only in the exercise of language, but in the creation of images, auditory, visual, gestural. We call them art and architecture and music and dance. The ability to construct meaning, to recover meaning in that form of language we call poetry, literature, as well as in the literal forms of language. The idea being that when youngsters go out into the world, and they're in the world when they're in school, but when they address the culture, the meanings that are available in the cultures are there for the taking if they know how to take them. If they know how to take them. And that if they know how to take them is really terribly important, because meaning is not given to anybody. Meaning is constructed, it's made, it's secured, it's appropriated. We don't just have experience, we take experience, we make experience. And therefore the provision of a program that makes it possible for youngsters to secure the meanings in the forms that culture makes available, in the variety of forms in which they exist in the culture, is, I think, a terribly important part of becoming multiliterate. And of course that means providing in the curriculum opportunities for youngsters to deal with such meanings, and to deal, therefore, with the forms in which those meanings are housed. So we kind of free ourselves from the idea that literacy in the narrow sense is primarily what it's about. Literacy in the broad sense is primarily what it's about. Meanings come in different shapes and forms and sizes, in varieties. And the best way to ensure semi-literate youngsters in schools is to make sure that they don't have access to many of the forms that are now marginalized, which are carriers of meaning in the school. I think it's important, as part of our intentions educationally, to help youngsters develop the skills necessary to ask fresh questions and to formulate the problems and the methods through which those questions and problems can be addressed. The most difficult of intellectual tasks is not problem solving. The most difficult of intellectual tasks is problem formulation. It's question asking. And it might be as telling in schools to ask youngsters to generate questions at the end of some kind of instructional period, let me say. Questions about what they have dealt with. Questions that puzzle them. And to take a look at what they are able to do in this domain as to find out whether they have the answers to the questions that we have posed about the subject matter that they have studied. It might also be a very interesting meta lesson, namely that in this class, this teacher is going to be as interested in trying to find out what I'm curious about, as whether or not I have acquired the content that was being taught. In a certain sense, the content being taught emerges in an interesting way in the kinds of questions and problems that are posable. In fact, I will tell you that at Stanford University, when our students run into trouble at the doctoral level, it is almost never in knowing the material that was taught in the course. It's working on a dissertation problem. It's formulating a telling question. That nice oxymoron, a telling question, formulating that and formulating the procedures through which it can be addressed. That's where the problems reside when problems reside. Developing an appetite for wonder and for speculation, creating a disposition to take off from the literal and to get into ideas that somehow give you access to forms of understanding that are not limited to the particular thing that you're studying at the moment. There's a lot of talk about time on task in the literature, and the general image that comes through is a youngster with his head down or her head down working in that workbook all the time. Some of the most productive moments I had in my elementary days was in daydreaming. And I'm not pushing daydreaming as a complete diet by any means. But what I mean to say is that the issue in talking about time on task is not simply located in focusing on the particular work that the teacher has provided, but providing space for youngsters to take off and to get into notions that are not simply limited to the particular content. Discovering your own personal signature. Trying to create opportunities for youngsters in schools to recognize that they have something unique and distinctive about their own perception and interpretation. One of the great contributions, I think, of the arts and the education of the young is that it provides them with opportunities to create images, literary, musical, visual, in which uniqueness of outcome is a virtue. In so many of the things that we ask youngsters to do in our classrooms, the structure of expectation is one that leads to convergent outcome. The early teaching of arithmetic usually has a common set of correct answers that youngsters are to arrive at. Usually that's the case. Spelling is a classic example. There are only two ways to spell a word in the English language. I should say three, actually. The right way, the wrong way, and the English way. But basically, you don't want, when you're teaching spelling, innovation.